Illinois, Mid-19th Century Politics and the Civil War, Part 2. Lincoln tried to calm the fears of Southerners in his inaugural address, but it did little good. South Carolina had already seceded from the Union in December, making good on its promise that if a Republican was elected president, the state would walk out of the Union. On February 8, 1861, six other states joined South Carolina to create the Confederate States of America. After the surrender of Fort Sumter and Lincoln's call up of 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion, the remaining Southern states joined the Confederacy in April and May. Soon after the Confederacy formed, Secretary of War Simon Cameron telegraphed Governor Yates and urged him to send troops to Cairo, Illinois. And I have a map here that one I used earlier. So at the very southern tip of Illinois is Cairo. Now, Illinois, in a way, is shaped like an arrowhead, a wedge into the south. At its tip were the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, where they met there at Cairo. Cairo was far enough north that it was difficult to be an offensive attack by Confederate forces. At the same time, it was far enough south to make it a good staging area for Union expeditions into the Confederate States. Furthermore, of the north-south railroads that served as gateways to the south, the westernmost passed through Cairo. So Cairo therefore became a hub of Union war effort in the West. Establishing a significant military force in the city was also politically important. Plenty of Southern Illinoisans, if not pro-Confederate, were at least on the fence about the war. Having a large army there convinced many to side with the Union. In 1861, the U.S. Army had only 16,000 men thinly spread over the entire country. No draft laws were in effect, so the Union had to depend on volunteers. Unlike the wars of the 20th century, here each state had to supply men as was needed. When the first call for volunteers went out, Illinois' quota, which of course was based on population, was supposed to raise 6 regiments. Governor Yates called the General Assembly into session, and the legislature rushed out of patriotism to authorize the formation of 10 regiments and appropriated $3.5 million to cover the cost. That equaled about 6,000 troops. In fact, about 100,000 wanted to join up. By summer, the Union Army in the East had suffered some major defeats, and Lincoln realized that he was going to have to call up more troops. He put out a call for 500,000. Again, Illinois had to fill a quota. Now, one of the motivations to avoid the draft was for men to volunteer. Many believed that the draft itself was dishonorable, and to avoid that, there was the encouragement for volunteers to join the army. However, despite a steady flow of volunteers, the federal draft eventually was instituted in Illinois in fall of 1864. By the end of the war, though, only about 3,500 men actually were drafted. The rest were all volunteers. So in the end, Illinois would supply 150 infantry regiments, 17 cavalry regiments, several artillery units, and over 2,000 sailors. About 255,000 Illinoisans served in the war, and about 2,000 of them were African Americans who served in segregated black units. In the end, about 35,000 soldiers died in battle of wounds, disease, or in Confederate prison camps. Now, Illinois was unprepared to house, feed, and train all the recruits that were flocking to the cities to join up. Officials started constructing a whole variety of camps throughout the state. Officials created the largest one called Camp Douglas in the north near Chicago. In Springfield, the fairgrounds were converted into a camp named after Governor Yates. Also, Camp Butler was created in Springfield as well. Camps had poor sanitary conditions. They were overcrowded, and everything from food to guns was in short supply. Some local merchants took advantage of the situation and overcharged the volunteers. Other citizens of the state just simply donated supplies. Volunteers from similar ethnic backgrounds created several Illinois regiments, as did men in certain professions. James Mulligan recruited fellow countrymen for his Irish Brigade. Germans filled the Hecker Regiment. In all, 6,000 Germans from Illinois would serve in the war, and these were immigrants from the different principalities in Germany, because Germany, as we know it today, didn't really exist yet. And so Germans were also the largest immigrant group in Illinois. Scots formed the 1st and 2nd Scottish regiments. Railroad workers together created a fighting unit, as did lead miners in Galena. The Rock River Rifles were farmers from that area, and so many ministers joined the Persimmon Regiment that people refer to it as the Preacher's Regiment. Also, Charles Hovey resigned as president of Illinois State Normal School to create a unit called the Teachers Regiment. Most of the volunteers were between the ages of 18 and 25, with a couple hundred over the age of 50, but there were plenty of men who volunteered in the 30s and 40s as well. The man who raised a significant regiment became colonel, whether or not he had any military experience. Officers were often elected by volunteers themselves. Mexican war veterans were primary candidates, but those with no military experience could also be elected too, so it became a popularity contest. Also, if you were trying to form a regiment and you had enough money to outfit the regiment with uniforms, you'd probably be elected colonel. The weapons that these early Illinois soldiers had to train with were not the best quality. The first regiments were equipped temporarily with incredibly old guns. Most of them could not fire. Later, the Union command at St. Louis purchased all sorts of rifles at actually very high prices. Some Illinois regiments were equipped with Austrian, Belgian, Prussian, and Spanish rifles. Some of these weapons were just dangerous to use. For example, some Austrian rifles had crooked barrels and would explode if the operator tried to use them. Others were extremely heavy and difficult to load. In summer of 1861, Governor Yates made several trips to New York and Washington in search of arms and equipment. He eventually persuaded the federal government to send Illinois 6,000 rifle muskets, other small arms, and a variety of artillery pieces. Much of this material went to Cairo. The Civil War was essentially a private's war. Each soldier stood in his appointed place in the line and fired his weapon as soon as he could load and aim. There were artillery used, of course, but 90% of the wounds that men suffered were from small projectiles. Some of these were metal from shrapnel fired from a cannon, but most were fired from rifles. Most Illinois regiments were eventually equipped with either the Enfield rifle or the Springfield rifle musket, I should say. And the Enfield was British and the Springfield was American. And here is a picture of Illinois troops. This is the Illinois 7th Infantry. The guns would fire a mini ball. It was shaped a lot like a modern day bullet. It was made of lead and, of course, could do great damage to a person. A very good infantryman could get off maybe 10 to 12 shots in 5 minutes. A typical Illinois soldier was equipped with a blanket wrapped in a protective cover, a haversack, which was similar to a satchel, a canteen, a musket, 40 rounds of ammunition, a leather cap box, a sewing kit, a bayonet, and his mess equipment. The mess equipment was usually attached to the belt, and the ammunition was carried in a cartridge pouch. The remainder was folded into the blanket roll, which hooked around his back and tied in the front. The Union armies in the East were committed to defending Washington, taking Richmond, which was the capital of the Confederate States of America, and trying to subdue General Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. In the West, the Union armies had two major tasks. One was to take control of the Mississippi, and the other was to drive a wedge between the western and eastern portions of the Confederacy. Some of the earliest fighting took place in Missouri, where Illinois troops had to suppress the rebellion. Head to head fighting actually was rare. Most of the time, Illinois troops were pursuing guerrilla fighters and fought brief skirmishes in Missouri, but this was where Illinois troops would first have their first military experience in the war. John C. Fremont was appointed commander of the Western armies in July of 1861. He appointed Ulysses S. Grant as commander of the troops in Cairo. Now, Grant was a West Point graduate. He was also a veteran of the Mexican-American War, and he was an uninspired businessman in Galena, Illinois. But because of his military experience, he received an officer's commission, and he wound up moving up the ranks rather quickly. Grant became a hero when his troops were engaged in two battles at river forts in Kentucky. I have a map here, these forts. So there's Fort Donelson and Fort Henry. Henry was actually easily taken with Admiral Andrew Foote's gunboats. Fort Donelson, though, was more difficult. And after some fierce fighting, the commanding general of the South, the Southern commanding general, sent word that he was ready to discuss terms of surrender. Grant replied, though, that he expected unconditional surrender. After these victories, Grant was hailed as a hero and was referred to as Unconditional Surrender Grant. With a lot of participation from Illinois troops, the Confederates continued to lose to Union forces. First, Nashville, Tennessee, then the river fortress at Columbia, Kentucky, and was forced to abandon because it was simply cut off from outside support. There was a 3 day battle at Pea Ridge in Arkansas, which ended up curtailing most Confederate activities in that state. Illinois troops stationed in Missouri, though, faced ongoing guerrilla style conflict with Confederates. One of the biggest campaigns of the West, though, was the Battle of Shiloh. Unconditional surrender grant, and then there's Shiloh. So Shiloh's in Tennessee. I'll put up the Shiloh focused map here. So here, Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston attacked Grant's 40,000 troops with his own near 40,000 man army before Grant could be reinforced. The attack came as a surprise and nearly caused Grant's army to break, but it rebounded, and word of Union reinforcements convinced Johnston to retreat. Johnston eventually died in the fighting, and his army lost about 10,000 men, or I should say 10,000 casualties. Grant's army suffered 13,000 casualties. Following the victory, Governor Yates and other prominent politicians in the West went to Shiloh to speak to the troops from their states. Yates complimented the soldiers from Illinois for their bravery in combat and for hastening the end of the war. However, Grant was attacked in the Democratic press for high casualty rates. Some editors called for his removal from command. It's important to keep in mind that in this era, as I talked about in the previous lecture, most newspapers were affiliated with a political party. So those newspapers that were affiliated with the Republican Party were, of course, going to be pro-war, pro-union. Those affiliated with the Democratic Party tended to be anti-war and tended to at least be sympathetic to the South. One activity in these campaigns the soldiers had to deal with, which would have deadly consequences, though, and that was foraging. Because in some instances, these troops did just not have enough or sufficient provisions. Therefore, living off the land became necessary, though this was not official Union policy. Still, soldiers would take what they could, from cattle to blankets, but they could also pay a heavy price if caught by Confederates. Mutilation before execution was quite common. Although Lincoln opposed slavery personally, he did not want to attack the institution when he became president. Keeping the Union together was his primary task. However, Lincoln began to think that ending slavery could help defeat the South. Levi Trimble, who is the there we go, who was the senator from Illinois, was an out-and-out abolitionist. He and other radical Republicans urged Lincoln to free the slaves. He argued that, number one, it was the moral thing to do, but number two, it could help defeat the South. He and others argued that this would bring other nations on the side of the Union as well. Lincoln agreed, but was concerned about timing. He realized that the action on the slavery issue would be readily accepted if there had been an important military victory. And that victory came with the Battle of Antietam that took place in September of 1862. This basically gave him the context that he was looking for. And so on January 1st, 1863, the final version of the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, and that stated that all slaves in unconquered states were now free. In the field, Illinois soldiers were divided. Some were extremely angry that the war went from being a war to preserve the Union to a war to free the slaves. Some soldiers hated abolitionists almost as much as they hated Confederates. One of the fears many whites had concerning freeing the slaves was that as freed people, they would come north to Illinois. So it's important to keep in mind that racial prejudice and out racism was rampant throughout the North and in Illinois in particular. Other Union soldiers, though, viewed emancipation as a noble cause. Justice was on the side of the Union and not the Confederacy. Ultimately, though, what sold the Union and Illinois soldiers on emancipation was that it could bring the war to a quicker end. Basically, undermining the South's labor force would help the Confederacy to collapse. Another factor that turned Illinois soldiers in favor of emancipation was that their only true friends in the South were African Americans. African Americans came in droves to the Union lines, and they would help with labor and with reconnaissance, and even more important, blacks wanted to serve as soldiers in the Union Army. Governor Yates, who was very supportive of the Emancipation Proclamation and of African Americans serving in the Army, was authorized by the War Department to create an African American regiment of infantry. And he was able to create the 29th U.S. colored infantry, with most of the folks serving in this segregated unit, Illinois African Americans. The 29th went into action in spring of 1864 and fought with distinction in a variety of campaigns, and of course it took its share of casualties as well. By 1863, Vicksburg, Mississippi was the last Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. And let me give you a map here of Vicksburg. So this is going to be a major accomplishment once the Vicksburg falls. So Grant was ordered to move his armies up and take the city. There were military and economic motives for taking the stronghold. Political considerations were important too. Western governors had to deal with a great deal of anti-war sentiment. So securing the Mississippi River would help to suppress dissent. Grant's commander from Illinois, Benjamin Grierson, led a month-long raid south of Vicksburg that harassed and tied up Confederate forces. Meanwhile, Grant moved on Vicksburg and laid siege to the city. He tried to break its fortifications, but in the end just had to starve out the military and the residents there. And the end came on July 4th, 1863. And I think for the next 90 years, the citizens of Vicksburg did not celebrate the 4th of July. When news of victory reached Illinois, people paraded, hung banners from buildings, and heaped praise upon Grant, who once again became a national hero. After his next assignment at Chattanooga, Mississippi, he was made commander of all Union armies. The siege of Vicksburg, though, was probably one of the last major actions in the Western theater, basically putting the South out of contention in the war as far as the Western part of the Confederacy is concerned. Some of Illinois' troops went on with Grant to Tennessee. Others were dispatched to General Sherman, William T. Sherman's march to the sea. Others still were sent to fight with regiments in other states. By the end of the war, Illinois soldiers were engaged in every major battle in the East and in the West.